Um, Hello, everybody. My name is Puneet Trivedi, and I'm the Chief Development Officer here at JYI. And JYI is a fully undergraduate-run journal that focuses on prioritizing the publishing, or not prioritizing, but publishing undergraduate research, and in general, promoting scientific communication and education uh, for all, but mainly undergraduates. And now I'll hand it off to my co-host Ashley, who will introduce herself and then introduce all of you, and we can begin with the questions.
Hi guys, I'm Ashley. I am a development director here at JY. I'm super excited to talk to you guys. You guys all have really interesting careers, so I'm excited to see the kinds of conversations that come from that. I'm going to start by introducing all of you, and then I'll ask you each a question about your general career as a scientist. So I think I'll start with Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he has been spreading the word in science in print, on TV and radio, and online via social media for more than 30 years. He's also the author of 47 books and counting, which is really impressive. So I was wondering if you could speak to your scientific work and training as a scientist, and how has that impacted your career now?
What was the beginning part of that question again? It was a bit fuzzy on the microphone. Say again, please.
Yes. Could you please speak to your scientific work and training as a scientist and how that has impacted your career now?
Oh, very straightforward. Moving into the media, I had the wonderful science background of ignore opinions, stick to the facts. And so that's what I've been doing in the media for the last 40 years, where I started off writing my first story on climate change back in 1941. Science is a terrific background because part of journalism and writing is fact-checking, and science is stick to the facts.
Great, completely agree. I'm going to move on to introducing Dr. Diana Saville. She studied biochemical sciences at Harvard College and began her creative work as a scientific animator while pursuing a PhD in molecular and cellular biology at the University of California, Berkeley. And I was wondering if you could also speak to your scientific work and training as a scientist, as well as how that has impacted your career now.
Yeah, first a point of clarification. Thanks so much, Ashley, for inviting me to be on this panel. I just did want to clarify, I'm technically still a PhD candidate, so you can call me Diana instead of Dr. Saville. And what happened, actually, I did my undergraduate at Harvard. I studied biochemistry. Everybody that I knew who was older than me, who I looked up to, was headed down that pathway to get a PhD. I headed to UC Berkeley studying molecular and cellular biology. And that is when I discovered really what ended up being my passion in life, which was scientific visualization and science communication. So my scientific training was incredibly important in making that jump, making that transition. And my first sort of foray into the working world was, it very heavily leveraged my ability to read scientific papers, to communicate with other scientists, to understand them. And then actually my art background, I have classical training as an oil painter, that factored in probably equally in the early works I did around scientific animation. And even today, as my career has evolved since then, and I do work in field development for neuroscience, I use that backbone of studying and understanding how to read scientific papers, the fundamentals of bench science. I use it every day in the work that I do.
That's great. It's amazing that you can go combine fields like that. It's really interesting to see. The next person that I'm going to introduce is Dr. Alexander Patananan. So he has attended UCLA for his Bachelor's of Science degree and majored in microbiology. He also did research in Drosophila genetics research, and he was also accepted into a doctoral studies program at UCLA. And I was wondering if you could also tell us a little bit more about your training as a scientist and how that affects your career now.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley, and thank you to the rest of the JYI team for inviting me to join my esteemed colleagues here as we talk to you about alternative career paths. So as Ashley mentioned, I went to UCLA for much of my training, bachelor's in microbiology, master's and a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. And during the course of my training, I was very fortunate to have very good mentors along the way, which is a very important aspect of good scientific training, is having good mentors. And I was able to learn a wide spectrum of interesting scientific facts and explored different scientific questions, all in the area of biochemistry, protein folding, and aging. And I, learned a lot about how to dissect scientific literature, convey scientific knowledge to a wide array of audiences, not just scientists, but other people. And as I progressed in my scientific career, got a PhD and went to become a postdoc for a few years, I wanted to do a little bit more because being in academics was a little bit limiting for me in that, you can only impact a certain number of people. And that ultimately led me to pursuing a career in medical communications, where ultimately I look at scientific facts and convey them to people of a variety of different abilities, from physicians to patients.
That sounds really interesting. Thank you for answering that. The next and final person I will be introducing is Abraham Dada, who is an aspiring physician entrepreneur who aims to use tech to expand access to healthcare, which sounds really interesting. I was wondering if you could also provide some background on your training as a scientist and how that affects your career now.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for the intro and for having me here. I'd say that my training as a scientist, it's still in the early stages. I just finished up, undergrad early last year, studying neuroscience and also sort of medical anthropology. I really used my undergrad career to explore different scientific interests. So from epidemiology from basic translational science as well, just to get a pulse check of the different type of work and research and questions you can ask, different sort of frameworks for answering these questions. I think right now I'm trying to use my gap year before going to med school to really understand how you can take a lot of these really interesting findings that you're getting in a lab and a theoretical sort of environment and applying it and translating it to consumers and for people to actually use.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. I'm so excited by all of your different career paths. It's very diverse. I'm really excited to hear your answers to questions.
Yeah, same, super excited. And so I can't wait any longer, and I'll jump straight into the more individualized questions, I guess you could call them. And I'll start with Dr. Karl, who's first on my screen. So you've talked a lot about climate change, and one thing that is interesting about climate change is the polarization of it. It seems like many people don't believe it or do, particularly in the States. And for something that is scientifically based, it is strange that we do not have one or the other. Of course, there will always be small pockets, but it seems as though there are two large divisions in the case of climate change. So why do you think it is like this, or if you think it's like this? And what do we do to bring everyone together so that policies can be driven forward to combat climate change?
Why is it like this? Because of 30 years of deliberate lies by big fossil fuel. So in the 70s and the 80s, big fossil fuel surprisingly did the best science into climate change. And they were right on board with the fact that it was happening. Around 1990, they then, to put it in Australian terms, chucked a U-turn or did a U-turn. What is the North American equivalent?
U-turn. Yeah, U-turn's
Yep.
fine.
So they chucked a U and started denying it, spending up to $1 billion a year, following the example of big tobacco. So read the book, The Doubt is Our Product by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, and they detail exactly the pathway by which they spent $1 billion a year for 30 years telling lies. And then also read the book, The New Climate War by Michael E. Mann. He's famous for the famous hockey stick graph. If you're not familiar with it, it shows that we were coming out of the last ice age and we were gradually heading into the next ice age. And over the last few thousand years, the temperature was gradually heading down. And then suddenly there's a little kick, like the blade of an ice hockey stick, and that's the global warming. And the fossil fuel companies that's the reason for the massive division, just fossil fuel companies. They want to stay wealthy. They're just following the lesson of the Godfather. Nothing personal, it's just business. Oh, a cup of tea, darling. Thank you so much. Look, a cup of tea. I'd like to point out tea leaves, none of this tea bag rubbish. So why is there such a large division? Because of the fossil fuel companies. They're in a unique position because they have a free right to pollute the environment. If you happen to be making solar panels or wood chips or garden furniture, you can't just throw your rubbish into the environment. Only the fossil fuel companies are allowed to do that. And they like that advantage. In addition to that, they get as subsidies, and this comes from an International Monetary Fund report, two of them from 2013 and 2019, they get 8% of all of the revenue gathered by all the governments in the world as a subsidy. They get it as free money on top of their massive profits. They're onto a good deal. How do we stop them? Have different politicians. That's a whole different thing. Read the book by Michael Mann, The New Climate War, to see how to stop them. But we can. There's nothing stopping us. We don't need new technology. We just need new politicians and try to reverse 30 years of big lies.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Karl, for that answer. And I'd be careful walking around if I were you, lest the companies get on your back. And so next, I'll move on to Ms. Saville. Could you and Abraham please speak on what BrainMind is and what it offers, specifically the internship program?
Yeah, I'll start generally. I'll talk about what BrainMind does, and then I'll ask Abe to talk about what he does or what he did on our team. So BrainMind loosely is an ecosystem across multiple sectors interested in advancing the most impactful ideas in neuroscience and making sure that they're able to be nurtured out of the lab and into society where they can benefit humanity. So our community is made up of neuroscientists, investors, philanthropists, entrepreneurs, people who know how to run companies, so operators and executives, everything from life science to tech. And of course, we have a smattering of media and policymakers as well. So what we're interested in is leveraging, there's kind of a gap, it's referred to as the valley of death, between what can be funded philanthropically, like basic research, and what ultimately has legs commercially and can be funded by mechanisms like VC and big pharma. There's a gap there, and some of the ideas that are in that sort of nether space, maybe they're just not good enough ideas, or maybe they're not necessarily, they have the potential, but there are many that really do have quite a bit of potential, especially in brain science and in mental health, to make a difference for large populations. And so we're really interested in those highly levered ideas. And what we do is we attract talent, capital, other types of resources, advisory resources into these companies, and really ideas that are not even yet companies, but are just sitting on lab shelves, ready to become something, ready to benefit other people. So that's what our community does. We bring together events. We have something called an engine, which functions sort of like an incubator. And the internship program, because we touch across all these different communities, from startups to labs to funding mechanisms like philanthropies and investors, what we do with our interns is we get them to jump in and get exposed to all these different areas within neuroscience, within the engine that builds ideas and brings them out to society. So the students really can take on a number, they sort of design their own internship in many ways, but what they learn to do is self-drive a project like an entrepreneur does. They pitch their own ideas. They can actually assemble a team of other interns under them and lead them. And it's everything from assisting with, Abe actually worked with our neuroethics initiative, which is all about making sure if we're going to be curating these important ideas that are going to benefit humanity, we better make sure we have strong ethical frameworks for which ideas that we source. And then there are students who help to develop a model for a new startup. Let's say it's a digital therapeutic that has not yet been approved by the FDA. And we're looking at the different market areas where it could help a lot of people. So we have students doing impact modeling for those type of ideas to help suss out which of them we should select and which of them should get on stage, be platformed, or which one of them we should actually attract investors towards. So this is a wide range of opportunities, but I'll let Abe speak specifically to the work that he did with in the BrainMind internship.
Yeah, happy to take it from here. So as Diana mentioned, I think like my most memorable project with the BrainMind team would definitely be my work with the Neuroethics Initiative. So with that, we sort of interviewed, as Diana said, the many stakeholders within this like neurotech sphere. So policymakers, entrepreneurs, investors, just to understand, like what keeps them up at night, what ethical quandaries that they're anticipate will affect neurotech. There's a lot of really interesting companies like Neuralink, Paradromics, doing really cool things, that have been pretty much like unprecedented. I think we saw this with, the sort of wave that happened with gene editing and all of the research with Cas9. I think there's sort of similar ethical questions that can be asked, with neurotech and how it'll shape, humanity as we know it. And so for my, background studying, anthropology in undergrad, I really used this opportunity in BrainMind to sort of, take an ethnographic pulse check, so to speak, and hear what these investors, policymakers had to say about this, to just sort of understand the framing for myself as I plan to engage and partake in this space as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for explaining BrainMind. And also, I believe the internship program is taking in applicants, right? And they can visit BrainMind website to apply if they're interested.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we take interns on a rolling basis. And during the summer, there's a full 12-week curriculum where we expose students to the wide range of careers that are available to them outside of the traditional academic path.
Right. So thank you. And next question for Mr. or I guess Dr. Dada now. In congratulations for your acceptance. So you currently work at Dream, a neurotech company focused on sleep care. What led to your interest in sleep research, and how will your digital sleep clinic work to improve sleep quality for those suffering from sleep disorders?
Yeah, definitely. I will say that I was able to find out about Dream working at BrainMind. So that's another plug for the internship for those of you who are listening who are interested in sort of entrepreneurship. But I think I became interested in sleep specifically after reading like Matthew Walker's book Why We Sleep. Gets a pretty deep dive at a high level on sleep and how it sort of affects our quality of life. I think it's really sort of accessible, to people who don't really have experience with science. And with Dream in particular, we're trying to sort of remedy the fragmented care pathway that is sleep care. So traditionally, you go into a hospital and you take a sleep test, and they put you under like a polysonogram test overnight. So it's this big bulky machine with a lot of wires, and they try to just track your EEG, listening to your snoring and whatnot. And then after that, you get to the provider, and they diagnose you with maybe insomnia or apnea, for example. And then you have to go to a DME. So this is like a different sort of stakeholder and the pathway. The doctor sort of just like sends you over. There's no communication, and they get you set up with like a CPAP machine or whatnot. And along this sort of fragmented journey, patients like sort of get lost along the way, sort of don't really feel like their care is really, consolidated for them. And so at Dream, we're just basically taking this system, integrating it entirely for the patient. And it's through a virtual sort of first, patient first pathway. And I think this is really exciting, especially as we saw with COVID, a lot of care is transitioning from sort of traditional brick and mortar care to virtual care. And so it's interesting to see how we can like expand care access through these virtual modalities and try to bring as many people along for the ride and not really sort of leave out these communities who haven't had access in the past.
Absolutely, and that's a great initiative. Well, just equality, right?
Yeah.
And inclusiveness. So thank you for that. And finally, Dr. Patananan, did you ever think about following the traditional path after a PhD, like going into academia? And if so, what made you change your mind? If not, what was attractive to you about industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what I would say is, when I was a PhD student and candidate, being in academics was the only route really talked about. And my professor was super cool, super great at mentoring, and I always envisioned myself being a professor. And so as I was a PhD candidate and student, that was 6 years. After I graduated, I went to become a postdoc, because that's what every good future academic does. And I was there for 6 years as a postdoc, working my way to becoming an academic. And it was a long road. And while it was productive, I got maybe 10 or 15 papers from my postdoc career in itself. It was challenging. And the window in which you could become an academic was getting smaller and smaller. And you had to have not just one Nature paper, for example, but several in Nature, Science, Cell, the big, journals. And it didn't really reflect also on the quality of science. Like, you could have 10 papers in Nature, but be a horrible scientist, but have, 10 papers in Journal of Biological Chemistry, but not get anywhere. And so it was incidents like that that made me look at alternative careers. And I would say the final nail in the coffin was actually when I published a paper on mitochondrial engineering. And my postdoc career was basically manipulating the mitochondrial genome so that we could fix people who have a mitochondrial disorder. And we came up with a tool that could actually transplant into cells mitochondria of our choosing and hopefully fix their metabolism, fix their cells. But one day I got an email from a mother who had a kid, and she said, well, I have this kid. She has a mitochondrial disorder. Can I use your tool right now to fix her? And knowing what I know of mitochondrial biology, if that kid has a mitochondrial mutation, I know that her lifespan is going to be very short. It's going to be pretty painful. And my tool is going to take much longer to develop and actually put in a person. And that was one of the key moments where, I really enjoy scientific research. But at the same time, the pace at which one can individually do scientific research is somewhat challenging. And it made me look at alternative careers, one of which was going into industry, working at Amgen. And here, it's kind of funny. My title is a medical communications manager. It's ironic because people always ask me, so did you major in communications in college? And I say, I definitely didn't. I have a PhD, actually. And it's a nice title, though, in some ways, because my job is to communicate science, just as a professor would communicate their science to other scientists. My job is to communicate Amgen scientists to physicians so they know how to use drugs, how to identify diseases, and also to patients so that they know how they can deal with their disease. So in a sense, I never left academia. I just took a different hat in a different space, but the same thinking and logics of academia all exist.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer. I think, well, hopefully it'll be inspiring to someone else as it is to me in terms of, coming up with what they want to do with their life. So thank you.
Yeah, actually, I want to add one more thing actually to that, is that I was very narrow-minded in the beginning. And again, my PhD was 6 years, my postdoc was 6 years. That's 12 years of life where I was very narrow focused on being that professor. And I didn't look at any other alternative careers until the very last year or so. And that was my mistake, because I should be more open-minded as to what other things exist out there that best fit my personality, best fit my interests. And everyone's different. Everyone has a different set of interests, skills. And I think that's a really important thing that I want to emphasize is that you should always be looking out for a career that best fits you, not just one that you think is the best, that's going to pay the best money, being a plastic surgeon or whatever. It's the one that best fits your interests and skill set. That's the one you want to aim for.
Absolutely, that's great advice. Thank you for that. And now, Ashley, if you want to take it.
Next, I have a question kind of for everyone. This is more of a general, broad question. So could you all just share a difficult turning point in your career that, in retrospect, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself and other students and scientists in that position?
Definitely, if you don't mind, I can go first because my response is sort of on the similar note where Dr. Patananan left off. So right after graduating Harvard this past spring, I actually got accepted into a sort of medical anthropology master's program at Cambridge. And speaking to his sort of previous note as to, how he was, dead set on being a sort of PhD and going down that route, like me too, sort of early on in college, I was like, oh, as soon as I finish my neuroscience degree, I want to get a master's in med anthro and like do an MD, PhD. And I was very sort of dead set on that. I think for better or worse, the pandemic, this sort of break in my education created space for me to reflect and learn more about myself and sort of what I want out of a career as opposed to like my idea of what a career would look like. I think as students, there is this divide because you're not actually working, right? Like you still have to learn the basics before you can work. And so you don't really see what's on the other side. And I think I used that time to be more reflective. I actually got back into my work with Brain Mind at the time, working with entrepreneurs. And I realized like this is more so the path that I wanted to get into as opposed to traditional, research route. I realized that wasn't really the lifestyle that I wanted. Speaking to Dr. Patanan's point again, like I think the pace was a bit too slow for me as far as like translating insights into things that people can use. And so again, like my piece of advice for students listening out there or what have you is to first like really reflect deeply on your values and what you want from a career, what you want out of life, and also just be open to different opportunities that come at you and don't sort of have this sort of rigid framework as to what you want to get out of things.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Karl. I think I saw you raise your finger.
Yeah, you're talking about careers here, and I think it might be useful. Firstly, I was lucky enough to grow up in Australia at a time when they saw education as a worthwhile investment in the future. So I've had 28 years of education for free, including 16 years at university, with degrees in physics and in mathematics, in biomedical engineering when I designed and built a machine to pick up electrical signals off the human retina to diagnose certain types of eye disease, and as a doctor and surgeon. And I've worked in all of those careers, including being a doctor at the Kids Hospital. I've also got several non-degree years of study in computer science, astrophysics, electrical engineering, and philosophy, just to round me off. I started off at the age of 19 in the steelworks, testing steels, and they wanted me to fake the results, and I wouldn't fake the results. So then I went to New Guinea and did research into hair and wool, where my boss wanted me to fake the results, and I wouldn't fake the results. So then I became a drug-crazed hippie filmmaker and did some of the first MTV videos in Australia, drove 400,000 kilometres in taxis, had two of my friends killed, got beaten unconscious and ran over one person. I then shifted out of that into working in a hospital system as a scientific officer whilst living in the squats, where to survive I had to boot out some Hells Angels and some junkies and learn martial arts and read The Godfather to learn lessons on how to survive in a very tough environment in the inner city. Then, after being a scientific officer, I drifted into then making T-shirts to earn money, as well as being a taxi driver, and then doing the biomedical engineering, and then doing some research in Columbia, in New York, Columbia Hospital there, and then went back and drifted. I had a few choices, and I chose to go down and become a medical person. I dropped out of medical school in year 4. To start up TV shows on Australia's national radio TV network, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, where I started up a science show that's still running to this day. But I left that after a year and then went back to do medicine, stayed in medicine, became a doctor at the kids' hospital, found myself working 100 hours a week while having a new baby. And at this stage, I decided to drop out and then travel around Australia. In Australia, we have 40% of the country is desert, as defined by less than 200 millimetres of rain a year, and 40% is too dry to grow anything on. And so I built up a 4-wheel drive, and on my biggest drive, we started off at the centre of Australia, went west for 1,000 kilometres, turned right, went north for 1,000 kilometres, did not see another human being for a whole month. Let me emphasize that. We did not see another human being for a month. And then from that, I became a 4-wheel drive test driver, which I did for 2 decades, where every 6 months they give me a 4-wheel drive to test somewhere in the Australian outback for free, which was very nice. Thank you very much. And then since then, have had parallel careers as, I was also a TV weatherman for a couple of years. If you've seen Morning Wars, mate, it's great. And so now I've got parallel careers as a TV person, as a radio person. I've finished my 47th book. I'm doing number 48 at the moment, and doing a dozen radio shows around the world, doing question and answer shows. End of career, still going.
And in all of that, what would you say was sort of a turning point? Was there any moment in all of that where you felt like, this is, I mean, I know it's tough to say because you did so many different things, but was there one moment where, you had something different?
Yes. One was, we had a show in Australia on TV called A Current Affair. And in the 80s, they were doing a lot of denialism about vaccines. And I was working in the kids' hospital as a doctor, and I just loved the babies. It was honestly the best job I ever had in my whole life. I never, apart from being a 4-wheel drive test driver in the outback, that's pretty good too. But being a doctor was the best job I had my whole life. And we'd had in Australia, thanks to widespread vaccination, with regard to the disease called whooping cough, which you might be familiar with, terrible disease. It kills babies. We had 20 years with 0 deaths. 0 deaths. Now, because I've been a TV weatherman for a while and worked in the media, commercial radio, and as well as government radio, I realised that in the media, the most important thing is not the program where you're talking to somebody on air. No. From their point of view, the most important thing are the ads. You're only there to keep people watching the ads. And so A Current Affair was coming up with denialism about vaccines so that they could sell more dog food or whatever it is they were selling. And I found myself in the position at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. That's when most people die, 2 o'clock in the morning. I found myself with a dead baby. The first baby dead in 20 years in Australia from whooping cough. And the baby died because A Current Affair wanted to sell dog food. We had a dead baby because they wanted to sell dog food. And so I drifted out of being in the kids' hospital, going back into the media more. And so that's why I've sort of dedicated my life to working in the media and trying to bring straight facts to everybody here in Australia. That was a big moment for me, because the woman was saying, but my baby's dead. But on Channel 9, they said that vaccines don't work. We didn't need to get vaccinated. And she's got a dead baby. What the hell am I going to do? Well, what I could do is go into the media. So that's here I am, the shambling hulk you see in front of you today.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Karl. after doing a little research before this panel, that story was really what stood out to me, and I was hoping you would talk about that for the turning point, and very inspirational. And so I think Dr. Patananan, you wanted to go next, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, that was a very good point that Karl raised, and it's something that every scientist is trained to do, trying to find the truth, trying to find the facts. And in my career, trying to move between academia to industry, one thing I was worried about is, does industry talk about facts, or does it just sell baloney? And my experience is through one company, so I can just give you that. I don't know what other companies do, but very fortunate that my company, at least, we hire trained scientists that try and interpret the data and try to accurately portray what is going on. And I think we need more people to go into those fields to convey information so that people can know what's happening, whether it be with a vaccine or whether it be with a chemotherapy or whatnot. I think also one of your questions was, do you have any regrets, I think, about, making a choice one way or another? And that's actually an interesting one, because initially when I switched over to industry, I had a regret. And the regret was, why didn't I do it sooner? Why did I waste 6 years of life as a postdoc? And I was talking to one of my colleagues, and my colleague was rather wise. And he said, well, there's really no regrets, because what you did in 6 years as a postdoc trained you to get to this point. And, some people's paths may be very straight, very linear. Other people's paths may be, more convoluted, and they learn more along the way. But the thing is, we become who we are through our experiences. And there really isn't any regret that you can have. Everything is just training you to be the best version of yourself at that particular moment in time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that answer. A lot of wonderful advice there.
Yeah, so I'll jump in and maybe address this from a different angle. I won't speak to difficulty. I would say that the major turning points that I had in my career were some of the easiest decisions I ever made. And I think the reason for that is, and really this ties into the advice that I would give to the students that are listening here, is run towards the things that really excite you and interest you. When I was pursuing a PhD at UC Berkeley, I was a little bit going through the motions, although I was just getting started and I was just sort of getting my feet wet. But I even noticed in the context of the conversations I was having with my peer group, with the other students that are heading through this program, I wanted to talk about other things. I wanted to bring in more into the discussion. I wasn't as singularly focused as some of my colleagues. And I sort of just had it in my mind that there might be something beyond academia already. There was already that seed. And really all it took to have ignition was to see, for me, it was something that I saw. I went, at UC Berkeley, you go to Lake Tahoe, you go and you attend conferences, scientists talk about what they're doing, you meet people. One of the scientists who gave a presentation included a 3D animation that in 5 seconds, all of a sudden, everybody in the room understood exactly what she was trying to say, because they saw this short animation that explained the dynamics of microtubule depolymerization. All of a sudden they were seeing it and they were like, got it, I get it. And I saw that. And it was like lightning struck me. I was like, whoa, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. I went straight over to that professor. I thought maybe they were creating animations in her lab and could I get involved in that? And then I found out it was actually an Emeryville-based startup that was working with Pixar animators to do these visualizations for scientists. I had no animation background. I barely knew Photoshop at the time. I was an oil painter, as a hobby, and I knew. And so I found this company, I tracked them down, I wrote to them, I brought my portfolio over to them. And 3 weeks later, I was working full time there, taking a leave from graduate school. And normally this might be something you would wrestle with, but for me, I wasn't running away from graduate school. Graduate school was interesting and I was learning things, but I was running towards something. And it was an obvious step. And I would say in a similar way, when I transitioned to co-founding BrainMind, I was at a stage in my career. I was actually very happy where I was. I was learning things. I was working for a Boston-based medical foundation. I was their chief innovation officer. I had every opportunity there. I loved it. I had great mentors. By the way, Dr. Patananan has talked about the importance of mentors. Every opportunity that I've come across in my career has been because of cultivated relationships with mentors. So that's another piece of advice that I would give the people listening here is make friends with people 20 years older than you that are doing interesting things that you think are fascinating. Make friends with those people, ask them questions, volunteer for them, help them out with whatever it is that they're trying to do. Every single time I've done something like that, good things have happened. So I'd say another major turning point for me, I was 7 months pregnant with my second child when this opportunity to co-found this social venture that just seemed so wild. And I'd never heard of any model like this before for an organization like this. So taking that step was a big jump. But again, it was like, this is the opportunity. And now is the time to jump and take this risk. So my advice, cultivate mentors and run towards things that are exciting to you, that fit your interest areas. I think we all kind of have that alignment. And the people that I've met in the course of my career, and now I have this community of thousands of people, the people that I meet that are happiest with what they're doing, they've had like 5, 6, in the case of Karl, maybe a lot more, careers during their lifetime. And so, stay curious and run towards those things that interest you.
Wow, you guys are all so inspiring. I completely agree with academia. The pace is very slow, and I feel like a lot of people aren't exposed to the different options besides academia that they could do, which is why I really like how this panel's going.
Yeah, I concur. And with that, we'll move back into some more individualized questions. And I'll start with Mr. Dada. So given the current state of the neurotech field, what subfield or topic are you most excited about or think will have the most impact on humanity in the coming years?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think right now, there are a lot of really sort of interesting areas in neurotech. I think the field as a whole is very, sort of early and emerging. But some of the topics that I'm interested in particular are really non-pharmacological treatments for mental illness. So I think things like sort of, treatment-resistant depression, for example, is a lot of really interesting scientific research, I will say. So for those of you interested in science, I think there's a lot of good, that does come out of basic science research that can be translated by people who, have other passions. But in UCSF, there's some really interesting research in using deep brain stimulation to treat treatment-resistant depression. And so you can see some applications in using, more brain-machine interfaces like the stuff Neuralink and Paradromics are doing in that sort of application as well. And then I think another sort of sector that interests me that's related is sort of mindfulness and allowing people to sort of have, a more deepened sort of sense of self using technology to sort of enhance that. I think, traditionally people can get this sort of sense of self-awareness through meditation and spiritual practices, but it'd be really interesting to see technology sort of, accelerate that process for people.
That's really interesting, actually. So thank you for that. And for Dr. Patananan, could you please describe your role as medical communications manager? And could you also provide some tips for finding a job in industry?
Okay, so that's a good question. I think before I get into medical communications, I should talk about my interests and what got me interested in academia. And what got me interested in academia were two things. It was the teaching aspect, communicating knowledge to somebody else, and also the research aspect, discovering something that nobody had seen before and then conveying that to somebody else. And when I was looking for careers, I wanted to find a career that most similarly matched my interests. And medical communications was that best fit. Now, what is medical communications? basically, it's a hodgepodge of different jobs all in one, but the main focus is communication. So for example, we all get assigned to a different drug. For me, I got assigned to a lung cancer drug that I was very fortunate to be on because it was in the process of FDA approval. And it actually was approved just a few months ago during my beginning time there. So I get to see the whole process of how a drug goes from kind of basic science to finally going into a patient. And what my job is to look at all the data that we have regarding this drug, all the clinical trials. I have to know the basic literature behind the disease state. I don't have to know everything about lung cancer. And again, I was a protein biochemist as a PhD, and then as a metabolism mitochondrial biology person as a postdoc. So completely different. And this is another key lesson to learn is you always have to be able to adapt and to change with different circumstances. So I had to learn about lung cancer, learn about the standard of care in lung cancer, learn about what patients have to deal with lung cancer, learn about our own data, and then combine all that so that we can produce material that can go to, for example, a physician or a pharmacist or a patient, telling them about different aspects of this disease. And what's pretty cool about medical communications is, unlike a professor, where usually you're communicating science to another professor or scientist, I have to communicate information to a wide array of people, from the very experienced physician, surgeon, pharmacist, to the very layperson, the patient who, in our disease state, they're usually in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And I need to distill really complex information so that they know how to take their medication, for example. What side effects should they be keeping an eye out for? And it really, explores your brain in a way, because you have to know how to view that scientific data and then convert it into different areas. Another aspect of medical communications is it definitely involves a lot of collaboration. And that's another thing. Scientists, we have to get used to collaborating, no matter if we're an academic or if we're an industry or if we co-found our own company or whatnot. We have to work with others. And medical communication is no different. I actually team up with 3 other colleagues, a lawyer, a regulatory affairs person, and a medical affairs person. And all 4 of us have to often look at different material that Amgen wants to use and make sure that it's, one, scientifically accurate, doesn't get us into legal trouble, doesn't get us into trouble with the FDA, and is accurate from a clinical perspective. And we all 4 have to come to an agreement. So it's great to have good working relationships with your colleagues. And that's what another thing about medical communications that really strikes out is really the collaborative nature of the field. One last thing I just want to leave off on, you asked, how does one get into this kind of career in industry? One is to always keep your feelers out there, searching for the next best thing for your interests. And the second thing is always to keep a close reach to the various colleagues that you've had throughout your tenure, right? As a bachelor's or in graduate school or in your career, we always say when like a friend moves out to a different state, oh, well, talk to you later, right? But then we never see them for a decade. You never want that to happen, because you never know when your colleague from 10 years ago actually picked up a career that you'd be interested in and learn about. And so definitely that networking is very important. It's something that should always be, instilled in everyone, to always make sure they always communicate with people that they've known in the past. And then the final thing I would just want to leave off on is, once you have kind of got into a company, to always make sure that the company that you get into has your best interest in mind. Okay. And this is super important. And as you've heard from the other panelists today, it's not uncommon to have different paths, different careers over time. And I'm fortunate that, at least at Amgen, and it probably is like this at other industry companies, is that they have a big interest in their staff. So for example, I am in medical communications now. Let's say in the future, I want to become more more of a regulatory affairs specialist. I can actually cross over and go into the regulatory affairs department and become a regulatory affairs person. Or if I want to be a legal person, although I'm not a lawyer, I can actually jump over into a different department and learn more of the legal aspects and that kind of work. I can even jump back into bench science if I really want to. And it's the company's goal of finding your best, area that matches your skill set. And, whether or not you have your own company or whether or not you're working at a company, that's the key thing, right? Is to match your skills to what you're doing so that you can optimize your output.
Right. And actually, I'm really happy that you talked about that because, that isn't something that you would think about, especially at my age where, you're thinking about what the company can do for you and, how to build yourself. You're just thinking like, can I please do something for the company? Like, and just let me in. So yeah. I really like that point. Yeah.
And, just to also we emphasize that we live at a very unique time at the moment. With COVID, my job actually went fully remote. It used to be in the office. Now we're fully remote. And other companies are doing the same thing. Now, what has happened is that there's what we call a war on talent, if you will, or a war on workers, because other companies want to come in and snatch, for example, people who work at Amgen because they have experience and they'll snatch them with extra perks. And we do that for example, other companies, and companies are snatching from here and there. And that's an important thing to know is that, you have to, instead of thinking about, oh, what can I give to the company? You have to think, what can the company give for my future development? Because I can always go to a different company, right? If this one is not benefiting my long-term career, my long-term interests. That's very important.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So for Ms. Saville, you're an expert in creative communications of complex scientific concepts and have developed many educational media for labs at institutions such as MIT and Harvard. So what is the most important aspect to consider when designing such media, and how do you condense so much information in a package format? So I know you already talked about this a little bit on, but could you explain, that exact process and, how you're able to, communicate it so effectively in such a small sort of media way?
So I guess there's two things. One, I'm already a very visual learner. I had to, studying for exams in college, I would make like murals for myself. It all had to tie together visually. It had to map. I had to be able to see it in order to be able to understand it. So there's a certain amount of the work that I do with scientific visualization that's just instinctive in order for so I basically build the map. This is how I can actually understand this concept. Oftentimes it's, for example, this new technology, and here's the application. Where does it fit into the body? How does it physically, mechanically do its work? What are the biochemical mechanisms? How do we show that? Signal transduction pathways. You probably are used to looking at images like these, but when you see it, for example, animated, you understand how that interaction cascades. And so I do think that, so they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think an animation is worth 1,000 pictures, and it literally is thousands of pictures stacked on top of each other. So you can just learn so quickly. But a big piece of what you learn as you start to do this across multiple clients and for different companies and different stakeholders is really just thinking about the audience and what it is that the person who needs to communicate something, what is their goal? Ultimately, are they trying to raise funds for the next research project they want to do? Are they trying to educate patients about how to use it? So it's really just going to depend on what the goal is of what you're trying to communicate. And then ultimately on the audience side, what it is that they need to learn. So you learn that over time with experience. I've been doing this for a decade plus. You interview the stakeholder, right? So if you know that your audience is going to be patients, you're going to, and Dr. Patananan, am I saying your name right? Patananan. Okay. Patananan, you want to be doing interviews with those stakeholders. If it's patients, you're speaking with patients or people who match that demographic, and you're understanding what types of communications are going to work well and not work, even to the point of A/B testing at the level of the script, at the level of what's called a storyboard in the parlance of animation, where you're sort of mapping out exactly what you're going to be visualizing. One other thing I got really excited about, and I wanted to speak about, that's unrelated, but just as important, because I know that your audience here are undergraduates, and they're interested in, you know, what am I going to do? Am I going to go get a PhD or an MD? Am I going to follow the academic path? What the people on this Zoom are doing is actually such a, even what we're doing here is a small segment of what's available in terms of the careers that you can take on, either with an undergraduate science degree and especially with a PhD. You know, you can work in pharma and life sciences, you can work in the startup biotech world or the startup digital therapeutics world. There's so much emerging in early stage tech companies that you can do with a PhD. And once you've had a little bit of experience working with some of these companies, you can actually head to the funding side. You can be a program officer for DARPA or for another government agency that funds this type of work. And you can help make the decisions for what type of new research is the most important in order to get funds. You can also work in private philanthropy. Hundreds of billions of dollars every year are given away in order for science to advance itself by private foundations and individuals. And they need scientists to advise what kind of ideas that they ought to promote, what they ought to be supporting. You can also do, there's this very wide range of medical communication, everything from working in life sciences and doing stakeholder education, all the way to mass media, podcasts, television marketing, and so on. And there's also the scientific publication route. You have people who are PhDs in neuroscience who are editors at Neuron, who helps to make selections about which science ought to be funded. There's a lot of, and I'm sure people that have gone the academic path can speak about the sort of gaps and holes in that system, but it is one of the best ways that we have to promote science and to let other scientists know about the work that's being done. So, I mean, actually, I'm really passionate about this. I want people to know that there's a massively wide range of opportunities, and that when you get a PhD, and even if you go down that road of postdoc, there's a glut of people who have that incredible sets of expertise and feel like they don't have anywhere to go with it, because if they don't get that ultra competitive professor position, and by the way, you might be perfectly qualified and have every paper under the sun, but if you don't, the year that you go out for jobs, find a program that's looking for exactly the type of research you happen to be doing for the last 6 years, it won't matter. So it's just such a crapshoot, and it's not something that you hear a lot about, but there are so many things that you can do. It's such an exciting thing. I don't want anyone to be turned off from the academic path, because there are 1 million different opportunities to veer off and do something really exciting and interesting with that expertise that you build.
Actually, I just want to chime in on that. I'm glad, Diana, you brought that point up, because you know, even I was stuck on the academic track for a long time, and then I was in that intermediate phase where I didn't know where I wanted to go. And you know, and I highly encourage you to do this too, is just to apply to a whole bunch of different areas that you may be interested in. For example, and it may be crazy in some ways. So like, I applied to be an astronaut. Obviously, I'm not in space, so I never got to be an astronaut. I applied to be an FBI special agent. Can't talk about what happened there. And a whole bunch of other career paths, right? And you notice these are all not necessarily in the life sciences. But for example, for the FBI special agent gig, that one, they were looking for people who could critically analyze information. And as trained scientists or medical people, that's what you do on a daily basis, right? You look at some information and you figure out what's the right path to go. And many careers that may not be labeled life science career paths, but just seem like everyday ordinary jobs, those actually highly value a scientist or a medical doctor perspective in life. So don't keep your vision very narrow, make it very broad. And there's many careers out there that can actually fit you.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both of you for that. The super inspirational message. I basically got like the possibilities are endless, and you know, that can only make one smile. So I'll also add that I know we're a little bit over time, but we have one final question just for Dr. Karl to finish off. So forgive me for asking another question being over time, but here we go. So you had an inspirational moment in your life when working for a steelworks. So you already talked about this, like where they wanted you to fudge the data. Well, and so I want you to describe this moment and explain the importance of self-confidence and self-doubt, because I really just, I thought this was like a super great message.
Well, there I was, 19 years old. I'm 19 years old. I'm a qualified physicist. I'm working at the steelworks. And they want me to test the fatigue resistance of steel. And I found that this steel was not strong enough. And so I checked my results, and blow me down, the steel was not strong enough. And I went to my boss and I said, look, the steel's not strong enough. He said, look, go and check your results. I wouldn't be unhappy if you'd found that you'd made a mistake. Notice that he was talking in a double negative. That's important. Because people sometimes use that when they're trying to get you to tell lies. And so I went and checked the results. I said I couldn't find any mistake. He said, well, go and check it again. I wouldn't be displeased if you found you made a mistake. So I checked it again, and then same again. And then he said the same thing. So then I got a friend of mine, a fellow physicist, to check it. And at this stage, I was 20 years old. You know, what do I know when I'm 20 years old? Nothing. And so I didn't realize until about 3 weeks in that he wanted me to fake the results. I wouldn't fake the results. Things went bad. I tried to go to his boss. The boss covered up. I had to leave the steelworks under a cloud. And so I went to New Guinea, where the same thing happened. My boss wanted me to fake their results as well.
And could you just quickly speak on the importance of like the self-confidence and self-doubt that you had, like to say no, and like, you know, you're not going to do that. And even though, you know, this is your career, and, you know, it could be derailing for you.
It was kind of derailing, but then I found myself heading in a different direction, which was going to New Guinea. So there I was going into a part academic, part research position as a junior person. And so I was leaving Australia and going to a totally different environment. So on one hand, I didn't really appreciate what had happened. And then while I was in New Guinea, the bridge that they were building out of the bad steel collapsed and 37 people died. And I was in New Guinea, and I didn't go and appear at the Royal Commission, and because I just didn't know enough. I should have put myself forward as an example of how, but the big company managed to, being a wealthy entrepreneur, cover up, you know, and get away with it. And so that was my first introduction to the forces of evil. And by the way, for everybody, at least once in your life, work in the belly of the beast. Work for the forces of evil, because then you will truly know what it's like from the inside. Other advice, be healthy. Healthy is good. You've got to do your exercise every day. Have relationships. Never have sex with anybody who has more problems than you do. I don't know. That's kind of it.
And I always appreciate your colorful sentences, Dr. Karl. Thank you so much for that. Again, I apologize so much for keeping you guys 5 minutes above the time. And of course, again, thank you so much for coming here and speaking to us. I've learned a lot, and I've also, you know, feel super inspired. And you guys are all role models. And Ashley, if you want to say anything.
Yeah, just echoing that. It's so refreshing to hear about so many different careers that aren't academia. I mean, especially the FBI thing. Now I'm like thinking about it, and it's just really cool to hear about. So yeah, thank you for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and of course, thank you to our attendees as well for, you know, coming here. We hope you learned a thing or two, just like we did. And yeah, bye. Thank you so much once again.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Have a
Thank
great
you very
rest of
much.
the weekend.
Have a good one, everyone.